after an astoundingly productive writing career that gave us War and Peace and Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy had a religious conversion. He became, in essence, born again as a kind of apostle of his own version of Christianity. He broke considerably with the Russian Orthodox Church for a number of reasons. He lays out in other venues, and he comes to a realization of spiritual fulfillment based on the Gospels primarily. The questions that he had been dealing with throughout War and Peace and Anna Karenina had been escalating, and he'd been wrestling with them in these long, meditative novels of ideas, as they are called, where he's trying to work out a way of balancing the concerns of the world with the concerns for spiritual world. And he comes to this revelation somewhat late in his life. And in 1886, after having had this enlightenment, let's say, he produces The Death of Ivan Ilyich, the first piece of creative writing he does after the conversion, and it deals with largely this this new fact of his identity, this political awakening, or this religious awakening rather, and he uses this story to dramatize his experience, but also to, again, work out some of the ideas, some of the kinks, and chart his progress, spiritual progress, through this process. And as such, it is a highly realistic work that has at its core a fundamental romanticism, in that it is a searching for an ideal. It is a belief in an ideal that propels the journey this character goes on, and or it is the discovery of the belief of the ideal, let's say. Exactly where they end up is a little bit more troubling, and you can read that in a number of different ways, but we'll get there. The story is fairly simple. If you just look at it and, in a simple plot breakdown, a middle-aged bureaucrat develops a mysterious illness, and over the course of some period of time, it's unclear exactly how much, but you get a sense it's somewhat rapid, he declines and dies. That's the story. If you want to just look at it as, surface. But what he does with it is really where all the magic lies. This is where he also sort of rises above the limitations of realism and discovers for himself the limitations of realism. And it is only when he does that you get the sense at the end of this story that his writing days are largely numbered in terms of creative fiction, if you will. As the great realist novelist of the mid-1800s, let's say, he bumps his head up against the potential or the capacity of his genre. And when he's done, he pretty much just hangs it up and says, okay, that was kind of pointless. That's ultimately what he says. He sees that fiction, realist fiction, as he had been writing and as he had mastered largely, was incommensurate with the task of representing the human dilemma of being caught between this world while aspiring to the next. And so it was shortly after Ivan Ilyich that he just hangs up and says, I'm not going to do that anymore. Now, he was a fabulously wealthy guy, and he didn't need to rely on his writing to pay the bills, as some did. Dickens needed to sell books in order to pay his bills. That was never really a factor for Tolstoy, but he significantly walked away from it, and he actually went on to go live. He did his best to live as the Gospels would tell, and give away all of his worldly possessions, and devoted himself spiritually to the following of Christ's teachings. And he walked the walk. You give him that. He gave away a lot of what he had, and he lived not quite as a peasant, but as peasant-ish as he could reach. Now, as with everything, I don't want to get distracted with a lot of the biography. He's a very compelling character. And there are points where you can see that thin veneer between his life and his fictional world. But we're going to try and push back on that. Just look at the story itself. It's a novella, it's a long short story, it's whatever you want to call it, really. It is a remarkable document if you just look at it for the plot that I laid out before. Middle-class bureaucrat gets sick, at the end he's dead, the end. But he starts off in a curious fashion. He starts off with the beginning first. He starts off with him being, having just died. Ivan Ilyich, the news breaks and he's dead. Oh my gosh. And you see the reaction to it. And then in the second chapters, relatively short chapters, you flash back to when he was born, and you get the childhood and the background, the backstory, and all of that. And then it takes him up through to the present day, where he actually dies. So you're starting with a kind of epilogue first. Interesting little technique. What does that do? Well, a couple of things. But you get the reaction of his contemporaries, of his colleagues, of his friends. We are taken inside the chambers where this he's working in a bureaucracy of he's basically a judge, and he has colleagues. There's a lounge, you get a sense, and where they're all sitting there and, perhaps just having a smoke at the end of a long day. And in comes this news, oh my God, he's dead. And then you see how this news is received by, work family, work friends, your parallel life. And this does a couple of things. It implants that, characterization of Ivan Ilyich, and obviously with his name in the title, the whole story is about sort of peeling that onion and seeing who is this guy. We're given this very objective and somewhat distanced view of him. We're not taken right to, the moment of his birth or the moment of his death. Those are both in the story, but they're after this opening, after we've already formed a little bit of an opinion about him, a little bit of a context for how to receive him. It is remarkable in the way the story pushes the reader back. The first sentence is one of my favorites. Tolstoy is famous for slam bang, knock it out of the park first sentences. In an era that saw this as a kind of major league of these of first sentences, those big, thick doorstopper novels all start off really slam bang with these great things, Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was this, it was that, it was this, it was that, it was this and that. You get these long, titanic sentences that are just so profound and suck you right into the world. And he was no slouch at that either. He was probably the best at it. You know, all happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. You know, whoa! Tell me more. These big, declarative, confident, world-framing statements just jump off the page. But this is late in his career, and he's done that. And maybe he doesn't want to go back there. So, the first sentence of Ivan Ilyich, the death of Ivan Ilyich, is: during a break in the hearing of the Melvinsky case, the members of the court and the prosecutor met in Ivan Igorovich's Shibak's room in the big law courts building and began talking about the famous Krasovsky case. Maybe you are, you know, up on your late 1800s Russian law studies, but I don't know what the famous Krasovsky case is. I don't know anything about the Melvinsky case either. And the name Ivan Igorovich Shibak kind of leaves me cold. But that first sentence assumes that it will be familiar to me. Or it assumes that I won't have the slightest idea and that these are just details that are sort of going by me, like, huh? What? Huh? They are details. They're minor details that probably mean a lot to the people in that room, but nothing to the people outside it. The hearing of the Melvinsky case. The famous Krasovsky case. Okay. It means nothing. It is empty. It just sort of lands on the reader and already they're kind of snoring. A good editor would probably say, what are you doing with that? Scratch that. You know, nobody cares. Who knows about that? There's no identification. There is no communication possible when you're dropping these 3 little data points that are supposed to draw in a reader, but instead just land like a dud. It's a bold move to start off your story with, I'm gonna be boring. I'm gonna say something that no one will get. I am going to deliberately flood my reader with stuff and nothing else. Bold. There is nothing in that first sentence that can easily be scraped out and you pick it up from the rest of the story and you're off to the races. Because right after that, something actually happens. What is it? Somebody comes in and says, gentlemen, Ivan Ilyich is dead or has died. And suddenly the plot is off and running. Suddenly we understand, like, oh, okay. I don't know who Ivan Ilyich is, but I know his name is in the title, so he's important. And now that I know that he has died, that is a positive action that I can understand. So I'm taking a name that has some significance. I don't know what yet, but it has some significance. And I'm told that something has happened to it, or that character has done something specific that I understand. Not filed a legal brief in a case in relation to another case in some other case that I have no idea about, but died. I understand death. And at this point, if you want to be completely lazy, you can close the book and be done. Because that's the whole thing. That is everything. That first sentence is about confusing details that mean nothing in the larger scope of things, that have no valence for anyone outside of the most narrow scope you can possibly imagine. But then somebody has something specific to say about somebody that actually means something to you, Ivan Ilyich, you don't know what they mean yet, but it has some importance. And so you care. That's the story. That's the importance. That's the theme that he's going to come back to again, between the minor details in life and the stuff that you actually care about and the stuff that you understand. You understand death. You don't understand the Melvinsky case. You understand death. Death is universal. Everybody gets it. That's the story. Of course, that's not the entire story. This story or this news lands in the room with, oh, he died. And you get a lot of that, wow, that's interesting. They read a little blurb in the paper where they're getting this news from about the death of him. It's your basic death notice. You know, this person died at this time, he was here, and, you know, he was employed here, and this is what's important about him. Okay. But then the next paragraph gives you a sense of the reaction in that room. Ivan Ilyich was a colleague of the gentlemen meeting there, and they all liked him. He had been ill for several weeks. People were saying his illness was incurable. His position had been kept for him. But there had been conjectures that in the event of his death, Alexeyev might be appointed to his position, and either Vinnikov or Stabel to Alexeyev's. So on hearing of Ivan Ilyич's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen meeting in that room was of the significance the death might have for the transfer or promotion of the members themselves or their friends. So just a couple of points about this reaction paragraph in the very beginning of the story. It's all framed from the point of view of the gentleman in that room, and it assumes that the reader has a certain familiarity with the broad outlines of their reality. Ivan Ilyich was a colleague of the gentleman meeting there, and they all liked him. That's baseline information that just orients the reader. He had been ill for several weeks. People were saying his illness was incurable. More baseline information, like, oh, okay. You're doing a little of the backing and filling after the announcement of his death. And then immediately that turned to his position had been kept open for him, as if this is the next most important piece of information in this story. For the men in that room, it is about his position. That is the way they receive it. So the story itself, narration, if you will, is grouping the reader with those people who are hearing this. Oh, that's too bad. He's dead. But he had that nice office, and you know, I think he was making a little more money than I am. And I could do that job. That turn assumes that the reader is aligned with the narrator, with the other gentleman in that room. So right there, that little movement gives the story a kind of deliberate intention. It opens it up to a kind of specific objectification, because all of these people are immediately receiving this news, and it's being reported very objectively, almost like it was, being read in a newspaper, giving the headline, he is dead, then filling out exactly who he was in the details of the story. And then, again, the backing and filling with the basic details. He was a colleague of all these people, and they all liked him. And he had been ill for several weeks, and his illness was incurable. So that orients the reader, and it brings them the readers brings them slowly over to the perspective of those gentlemen in that room, who are looking at this information in a very subjective way. It's a very objective laying out of their particular perspective, which is opportunistic, to say the least. So that's significant, I would say. You get the you get this nice little scene that follows of a friend of Ivan's. The camera sort of pans over, let's say, to Peter Ivanovich, and he is a colleague of Ivan's, and he will identify himself as a friend. They went to law school together. They have known each other for, several years now. But still, this friend of him, presumably somebody who's known him the longest in this group, he's the one who's starting to think the most opportunistically, perhaps, or at least among the most. But then we follow him. He goes, and you see him go like, geez. Yeah, I gotta go to the wake, I gotta go to the funeral, all this stuff. Oh, geez, my schedule is packed for the week, and they live so far out. I gotta go pay a call, and it's gonna be a pain. And you're getting this grumbling, which I find particularly recognizable. Whenever you have like sudden social engagements that aren't necessarily going to be fun, it's like, oh God, I really have to do that. I got to put on the uncomfortable shoes and go. It's a schlep, and it's probably going to be rush hour. And he is making all these very familiar, recognizable, very human complaints that we all are subject to. And he goes to the funeral or the wake or whatever it is, and you see him enter the room and be a little uncomfortable. You see him trying to figure out what to do. He doesn't know. Peter Ivanovich went in feeling, as is always the case, at a loss as to what he should do there. One thing he did know was that in these circumstances it never does any harm to cross oneself. He wasn't altogether sure whether one should also bow, and so he chose a middle course. Entering the room, he started to cross himself and made a kind of slight bow. So he's not sure, when do I do this, do I do that? All right, well, I'll kind of do each halfway. That middle course is significant. Little phrases will just seep in there, and they're not accidental. We are told that that Ivan himself is the middle of three brothers, the middle. Again, translation is difficult, but when you see words repeated, even in translation, you can sort of lean in and say, that's curious. Why that phrase? Why not say that he had one older brother, one younger brother, and leaves that middle thing to be determined? Middle phrases. Ivan is always being spoken of in terms of choosing a middle course, a middle of the road kind of guy. His older brother was one way, his younger brother was another way, and he chose the middle, stayed safe course. And that's what we're told about him again and again. And here Peter is largely the same thing. He's not sure how to act in this situation. It's awkward. Anybody who goes to a funeral, yes, it's very awkward. You're sitting there and there's ceremony mixed in with just having polite conversation, but it's not polite conversation because it's around this very uncomfortable subject. So you feel uncomfortable, you don't know how to deal with it. And Peter is reflecting that. Well, I don't know how to behave here. And he is uncomfortable because it is essentially a funeral. There is a dead body in the room with them. And that makes him very uncomfortable. And he's looking around. He's just sort of like, okay, I got to go pay my respects to the widow. And he's checking things out. Okay, yeah, I know that guy, my buddy Schwartz over there. He's giving me the eye, and he wants to go maybe get in a little card game. Go sit down, have a few drinks, and see if we can have a little fun. No reason we're all together here, no reason we can't just suddenly sneak out and, make light of it. That's awkward. He sees the widow, he sees the daughter, he sees the son, he sees this manservant, Gerasim, whom he recognizes from previous encounters at the home. Reading the peasant manservant, Gerasim, he is identified very clearly as a member of the peasantry right at the beginning. Is that really the most important thing to know about someone? Well, evidently in this context, yes, according to Tolstoy. The peasant manservant Gerasim stepping lightly in front of Peter Ivanovich, scattering something on the ground. Stepping lightly. He is associated with stepping lightly. He is very light in his feet. He is not heavy. You can look at this as well as a servant. He's supposed to be, servants are supposed to be just sort of there, and they're not particularly intrusive, so that's a good thing. And, if you step too heavy, you rattle the china and things get broken. Fine. But also, he is light. Now, you can look at this a couple of different ways. He is not heavy, meaning he is perhaps imbued with a kind of characteristic of lightness, pointing up. Or perhaps, and here we're getting into a translation issue, perhaps he's associated in some way with light, physical light. He is a creature of the light as opposed to the dark. You can go a couple of different ways on that. But he's an interesting character who's just sort of noted there. It's like, oh, okay. And he's doing something. He is spreading something on the ground. Well, what is that? Well, this is a religious ritual. This is the peasant class, orthodox perhaps, but this is a traditional ritual for the dead that he is performing. And he knows what to do. He is doing something. Scattering something on the ground. He has a specific task that he's going about doing. Peter is sitting there, he doesn't know what to do. He's sort of doing something, but then not really, and then trying to do the other thing, and I don't know really what to do. But Gerasim has something to do. He knows what to do, and he is doing it. Interesting contrast, and that will come back. Peter gets shuttled into a meeting with the widow. The widow essentially drills him for money from their employer, saying, well, okay, I know that as a widow I'm entitled to certain things, or at least she's playing dumb about, well, I don't know if I'm allowed, but she knows very well what she's entitled to, and she's just trying to eke out just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. And her husband's funeral seems the perfect opportunity to do that, because everybody feels bad for her, everybody's coming up to her, and everybody feels like they want to make her feel better, so it's a perfect opportunity to put the bite on them. The widow comes in for some rough treatment, and that's it's a persistent and sometimes distasteful theme throughout. She finds out that, oh, this guy can't help, and then there's, no reason left to talk to Peter. It's like, okay, she basically dismisses him, and then he feels kind of relieved, like, oh, okay, now we can go catch up with my friends and play cards. And that's the opening. That is chapter 1, and we're given this very objective view of Ivan and the life he had. Very ordinary, very proper, very bourgeois rather, and not particularly sincere in any of his relationships. His wife doesn't seem to give a damn that he's dead. His friends really don't give a damn that he's dead. It's all so, they're all just going through this empty formality of behavior. Just going, you know, okay, here's the wake, I'm just going to go up, I'm going to shake the widow's hand, I'm going to say a few consoling things, leaning in, lowering my voice in a way that seems very genuine, and then the whole time I've got my eye out on my buddy over there, and we're going to go get a drink and start to play some cards, because that's really what I want to do. I want to get out of here. That is the level of sincerity that Ivan Ilyich has inspired in his time on Earth. Chapter 2 begins in a more recognizably Tolstoyan way with a slam-bang opening sentence. Ivan Ilyich's past life had been very simple and ordinary and very awful. Boom! There you go. That is the Tolstoy I know. That is Tolstoy giving his full-throated approval of his own capacity, to coin a phrase, to initiate the proceeding of the novel. And from here we are locked in with Ivan Ilyich. The prologue of chapter 1 just gives us that sort of objectifying frame that we put around it. So now everything we read about Ilyich is going to be, but in the end, nobody gave a damn about him. Everything he's doing is great, but in the end, nobody gave a damn about him. So the reader has that frame throughout, so that all of his little dramas, as he learns even that he's going to die, the reader is primed for it and says, well, yeah, we know he's going to die. He does die. But what are you worrying about? Nothing you're doing matters. Interesting perspective that the text and the way it is organized imbues into the reader. But here with chapter 2, we are given the Ivan Ilyich story proper, and it's where we're told about his childhood, about his father, about him being the middle child of 3 sons. He wasn't as cold and precise as the eldest or as hopeless as the youngest. He was somewhere between them. Very persistent note that he was just Mr. Even-tempered and just went about life doing what he was supposed to do. He did, you know, reasonably well in school, but not outstanding, you get the sense. And he entered the professional world, just working his way steadily up the ladder, just your average bourgeois drone in Tolstoy's view. Throughout the 1800s, you get this series of realist novels and stories of clerks that just keep popping up, who are supposed to be just anonymous little monads within a vast and Byzantine bureaucracy, which gives them a sense of real alienation from anything meaningful in any way, and is supposed to mirror the rapidly urbanizing cultural world of the post-industrial era of the 1800s. And this is Ivan. And he has a perfectly ordinary and perfectly awful life. You see him go and just go from one job to another, and each time he has to go to a new city and set up there, and he will ingratiate himself with the proper people, the right contacts, so that he's always having, you know, relationships that are materially beneficial to him. And then, well, he got a promotion, so he just drops all those people entirely, moves to a different city, and goes about the whole thing completely forgetting about anybody else in his past. That's Ivan. Along the way, he gets married. This, you know, young girl who prospects were good. She came from a decent family. She would make a good hostess. All of these little outside social concerns that had nothing to do with particularly having anything in common with the girl. or, you know, even much liking her, but it seemed like the right thing to do, and so he did it. And during all this, he's setting up a pattern where he's just accepting, you know, I just want to be sort of protected from anything that's going to threaten my calm. Calm is repeated again. You see that word calm in various iterations throughout, where he just wants to be sort of bubble wrapped in his own little reality, where he has his work and, you know, everything else just sort of takes care of itself. And Ivan Ilyich did develop for himself such a relationship with married life. He required a family life, only those conveniences it could give him, a dinner at home, a mistress of the house, a bed, and most importantly, that decorum of external experiences which were defined by public opinion. A man completely enmeshed in his role in society and in the proper appearances of things. A man very much of the bourgeoisie, a man who we know as readers already, having seen how it ends up, a man whose life comes to nothing. In the course of all this, he is, of course, getting wealthier. He's doing better. He seems to be always outspending himself a little bit. You get the sense that, especially with home decor, he was always starting to build up whatever house they were moving into. They're moving a lot, so every time you get there, it's like, okay, new furniture, new drapes, new rugs, new everything, new wardrobe because we're going to have a new me. He grows a beard because he wants to look more official, and it's all about appearances. It's all about the material trappings of his life. And the hanging of drapes becomes a rather momentous occasion. He is trying to hang drapes just the right way. He had read about it, I believe, in a book. He is very interested in the latest European styles, the fashions, and he wants the drapes to look a certain way. So he gets up on a ladder and starts to hang them himself, and he falls and hurts himself. Significantly, however, once again, he wanted the drapes hung, he missed his footing and fell, but being a strong and agile man, he held his balance and only knocked his side on the handle of the window frame. Held his balance, always trying to be balanced, but he hurts himself. He hurts himself trying to dress up his surroundings, trying to hang European drapes, let's say, in his new Moscow apartment. I think it's Moscow. It might be St. Petersburg. I'm not entirely sure. They mean different things. But he hurts himself, and it's just sort of a mysterious injury. He gets a bruise on his side, and he doesn't really know why or how, and it's like it doesn't go away, and it starts to ache. And this persists, and it keeps going on. And it's infringing upon his ability to pursue his ordinary life. They were, well, the family was somewhat getting irritated with him because he was kind of complaining more. He was getting a bit grumpy, and they were not particularly consoling about that. They didn't have a lot of patience. But it happened that this discomfort began to grow and became not quite pain, but the consciousness of a constant heaviness in his side, accompanied by a bad mood. This bad mood, which got worse and worse, began to spoil the pleasant course of the easy and decorous life that had been established in the Golovin house. Husband and wife began to quarrel more and more often, and soon the ease and pleasantness disappeared, and only decorum was preserved with difficulty. This is the image of Ivan Ilyich's life. Ilyich is his patronymic, and Golovin is his proper family name. Russian names are very confusing. But all he wants is the decorum, the outward appearance. Decor and decorum are kind of the same word. He wants the outward appearance of calm and propriety. But he's getting like cranky because he has this ache and he feels like his family is not being particularly sympathetic. It is disturbing his peace of mind. So he goes and he starts seeing doctors. You know, doc, I got this pain. What's the deal? And the doctors all look at him and they sit there and they study and they go, oh well, let's do this and let's do that. And this is all farce. This is all Tolstoy, taking a sledgehammer to the Enlightenment faith in reason. The belief that, well, the human mind is infinite and can contemplate all of creation in its capacity. And he just laughs at that. And so he has these doctors who just sort of like mumble to one another. And it's ridiculous. And they come up with these ridiculous conclusions about what possibly could be wrong that are usually quite countering one another, so that everybody has a different opinion. None of them make sense. They settle on one, or at least one rises particularly conspicuously, in that he has a floating kidney. A floating... Now, I'm not a doctor. Maybe this is a thing, but I kind of doubt it is. Whatever a floating kidney is, it sounds ridiculous. And at one point, later on, when he is scrambling around for some element of control, Ivan Ilyich will use his mind to try and lock his kidney into place, to try and stop his kidney from floating through the power of his mind. This is Tolstoy laughing at the Enlightenment and the belief in the limitlessness of human potential. He's saying, no, we're dumb. We're not going to be able to do that. But it is fun to watch. The he tries repeatedly. He says, he tried to force himself to think that he was better. He's trying to play mind tricks on himself. He tried to understand his kidney and to halt it and strengthen it. So little was needed that he thought, no, I'll go again to Peter Ivanovich. That was his friend who had a friend who was a doctor. And he's always scrambling for, okay, no, I can solve this. I can make this work. I can do this by myself. And the whole time he is just getting further and further estranged from his family. And slowly but surely, doubts start to sink in. It's like, these things, this is starting to get serious. This is not curing. This is not healing, rather. Since he had become ill, he slept in a little room next to his study. He went in, undressed, picked up a novel of Zola, the naturalist French novelist, who Tolstoy hated, because he dealt so much with man's animal nature, let's say, which he didn't read. So not only is he taking a bad book off the shelf, but he's not even really reading that. So this is Tolstoy really just, getting, he's just getting some venom out of his system. He began thinking instead, and he says, he's trying to figure out, well, what is going on? It's something around the appendix, and, what I can just think about it. He's had no medical training, but he can just think about it and make it, somehow get back into line. He says, only nature needs a little help. Nature needs help. This is Ivan Ilyich channeling the good Enlightenment tradition, and Tolstoy mocking him for it. And so, he's sitting there drawing on this train of thought, and it dawns on him, I won't exist. What happens, He cannot imagine it. From his perspective, his very isolated, self-centered perspective, if he doesn't exist, nothing exists. And that is, he can't make sense of that. Very famously, he comes up and he starts conjuring the image of Julius Caesar, and here he's calling him by another name, Caius. Caius is a man, men are mortal, therefore Caius is mortal. It had seemed to him to be true only in relation to Caius, but in no way to himself. He can imagine the abstraction of one particular man, and even as a man who represents general man, but somehow he doesn't see himself factored into that. There is no communion of humanity in which he can take part in that. He sees himself as separate, as special, as adhering only to laws unto himself. And that is a troubling place to be in Tolstoy's vision. The family continues to isolate him. He gets more and more irritated with them, but he does strike up more of a relationship with his manservant, his peasant manservant, Gerasim. And Gerasim starts to help take care of him around the house in doing things that probably outside his normal course of duties, and ones that are very human and very universal. Special contrivances had to be made for excretion. And every time this was a torment for him, a torment because of the uncleanliness, the loss of decorum, and the odor from the consciousness that another person had to take part in this. So Ivan Ilyich, being very ill at this point, is having trouble pooping. And he is embarrassed because he has to have help doing this. And he is offended by the uncleanliness of it. He's offended by the odor. He's offended by the loss of decorum, the appearance of it all. It makes him look so vulnerable. But mostly from the consciousness that another person had to take part in this. Another person had to share his pain, had to share his humility, his humanity. And this is a source of some outrage for him. But he seems to appreciate it from Gerasim. Gerasim is a very decent man, and it is driven home exactly how we are supposed to think of him. Gerasim was a clean, fresh, young peasant who had filled out on city food. You stay lean in the country, you come to the city, you get a little tubby. He was always cheerful and sunny. At first, Ivan Ilyich was embarrassed by seeing this man, always dressed in his clean, traditional clothes, having to do this repulsive job. Clean. He is very clean. We are told that Ivan is outraged or embarrassed by the uncleanliness of his humanity. But Gerasim is, one thing we know about him, because it's punched like 3 times in that first paragraph, he is very clean. Clean peasant. These ideas are driven home. Gerasim came in with firm, light steps, in his heavy boots, giving off a pleasant smell of tar from the boots and of the fresh winter air. He had on a clean Hessian apron and a clean cotton shirt. You getting the idea? He's wearing traditional peasant dress. He is very clean. He has excellent teeth, with no probable orthodonture, but you know, I'll buy that, sure. He's being presented as an ideal. So much so that when Ivan discovers that, well, my feet feel better if you, Gerasim, just lift them up and you hold them. And, you know, yeah, sure, they're okay if you put them on the footstool or on the ottoman or whatever it is. But it's really much better if you just personally hold them up. And so Gerasim just said, oh, okay, sir, I would love to do that for you. And he's very pleasant, very accommodating the whole time. So much so that, you know, for long stretches of time, it seems, he just sits there and holds up his boss's feet. He's a footstool. Is this realistic? Now, I get that in this world, there are very dutiful house servants who feel a genuine empathy for their bosses and would do this. But it seems to stretch credulity here. Just a little. This could be a Tolstoyan blind spot. If you look throughout all of his work, he valorizes the peasant class, and he has particular love for the labor of the peasant class. And famously, character Levin goes out and reaps wheat, cuts down wheat with the peasants just to, feel the good Bronley tired of the end of the day of a good, honest, hard day's work. And you see this celebration of peasant values and peasant life over and above the corrupt, Europeanized, bourgeois, effete, lazy class. The aristocracy that Tolstoy lived in essentially his whole life. Towards the end of his life, of course, he started to, to walk the walk and start to go and live more as a peasant, but as a very wealthy peasant, a peasant with a lot of rubles in the bank. But still, you're getting the sense of he is an ideal. Now, I would say he is a troubling and a flawed ideal because he is so unrealistic. And everything up until this is sticking so close to realism. This sense of, Ivan Ilyich is having trouble with his excretions, and that is about as real as you get. And then in the next step, we're getting this idealized figure of Gerasim, the peasant Superman, who is essentially a Christ figure. And it just feels a little imbalanced. That's me, my opinion. But he is set up as this kind of ideal. And more that contrast plays out, where throughout the story, Gerasim is the noble peasant, and in contrast to his family, and obviously we've seen his friends, who don't seem to give a damn that Ivan is dying. And that's the dynamic. Ivan lives through it, and he gets more and more embittered, and he's lashing out at his family. His wife comes to him at one point and says that, well, okay, I'm going to go to the theater with our daughter and her new boyfriend, who's about to become her fiance, and everybody's sort of waiting and whispering for this moment. And she comes in, and she's all dressed up, and Tolstoy makes particular mention of, the dress that she's wearing is fairly low cut, it would seem, and Ivan is disgusted by this. Ivan is revolted by this. There's a persistent theme of misogyny through this story. The wife is the nag. The wife is the scold. The wife is always going out and spending all the money and making him corrupt and preventing him from finding his truth at the end. And some of this might be biographical. When Tolstoy was writing this, he had been married for some time, and his relationship with his wife is quite famously tempestuous, you might say. And so there is a little bit of a sense of score settling throughout in his portrayal of married life, especially in the earlier part, when you see that, all he really wanted was to be left alone. He seems to be acknowledging that, well, all right, this isn't all on the woman, but Ivan has some skin in this game too. He's not the easiest person to get along with, but he does come down particularly hard on the wife. And it's not just the wife, I would argue, because the daughter is also sort of tarred with that same brush. When talking about the two surviving children, they mention very blithely that throughout the course of fast forwarding through their life growing up, and in a little subordinate clause within a sentence, you get, and then they lost two children. Major thing, but just sort of blithely passed by, like, yeah, two children died. Children die in the 1800s. You got to get used to it, but still, that sense of distance from it, that sense of just objectification of something that is so personal. But in discussing at one point the daughter and the son, the one son and the daughter who survive, the daughter was said to be very good looking and the boy was a good student. Superficiality, studiousness, when they come in to go to the theater, the daughter is said to be all made up. She's wearing makeup. She is also kind of dressed up, and you get the sense that maybe, and the soon-to-be fiance or whatever is forgettable and pointless. So you get a sense of real judgment there, real harsh judgment, and Ivan is disgusted by his family, and he blames them, and he says when his wife comes to give him a little kiss on the forehead, he sort of pulls away, and he's revolted by her. This is pure misogyny. Now, part of this is, at this point in the story, he's essentially lashing out. He's blaming everybody else for not feeling any empathy for him, for not feeling any pity for him. But throughout his life, he has felt zero empathy or zero pity for anyone else, as far as the reader can see. There is no sense of self-awareness there. He goes through a period of essentially Tolstoy taking up his version of Job. He wept for his helplessness, for his horrible loneliness, for people's cruelty, for God's absence. Why have you done all this? Why have you brought me here? Why do you torment me so horribly? That's Job's question. Job seems to get it on a more vast scale, and when it's coming out of Ivan's mouth, you're like, well, you're still living a fairly cushy life. Yes, you're dying, but is it really your place to question God? Which would be the question for just the question essentially that God returns to Job. But he is still lashing out. He's still seeing himself very much as the victim, and he still feels resentful to everyone around him and to God himself here, that he himself, Ivan, is having to undergo all this, and he just doesn't seem to get any sense of responsibility for what's happening to him. Of course, in the end, he wrestles with his problem. He has a kind of escalating physicality. People will suddenly look at him and he's just emaciated. And he draws that conclusion that from the way people react to him, he knows that, okay, I must be really in trouble. Not through any self-knowledge, but just the way people react to him. Again, very much about the appearance of things and how his reality is socially determined. The end comes when he's essentially given up on everybody, sending everybody away. Leave me alone, doctors, I don't care, you're not doing anything. He gets very upset that they keep talking about the physical nature of the thing and the floating kidney and all that, but they won't answer the one basic question, the one question that he has. It's a question of life and death, and which is it? And they won't go near that. And he is now confronting that and feeling impatient with everybody else who won't do that, which is another version of that initial scene at the funeral. Nobody wants to face the ultimate reality, which is death. Nobody wants to deal with anything on that plane, so they distract themselves with all of these other things. Peter in in that opening scene, the funeral, is distracting himself by noticing, like, you know, okay, different people are doing this, and hey, I know that guy, and hey, I know that person, and oh yeah, that's his daughter, that's his son, and oh, there's Gerasim, and what's he doing? Who cares? Distracting himself with all this stuff, just like Ivan has been doing throughout his life, distracting himself with all the materialism, with all of the job opportunities, with all of the worldly concerns, the trivia of life that he so focuses on to the exclusion of any perspective other than his own. All that falls away at the end. He's lying there in bed and he's clearly about to die. He has images of, you know, or sensations of being stuffed into a large black sack. And resisting it. It says he was presented from climbing in by his declaration that his life had been good, asserting that, no, I was right all along, I did the right thing. He's clinging to that desperately at the end. Suddenly, some kind of force struck him in the chest and on the side. His breath was constricted even more. He collapsed into the hole, collapsed passively, no agency on his part, collapsed into the hole, and there at the bottom of the hole, some light was showing. Light at the end of the tunnel, distant light, head to the light. Gerasim's very light, the way he walks. You can interpret this a number of different ways. There happened to him what he used to experience in a railway carriage when you think you are going forward but are going backward and suddenly realize your true direction. And so he has this reversal of sorts where he recognizes that he's been going in the wrong direction all along, and that kind of sense of dislocation that comes from it, which is quite brilliantly put in very physical, realist terms in this ultimate metaphysical moment. Yes, everything was wrong, he said to himself, but it doesn't matter. I can do what is right. He admits that his entire life has been a mistake. He has pursued the wrong life throughout. And it comes as an epiphany, a sudden realization that, yeah, I get it now. I'm on death's door and I'm recognizing that my entire life leading up to this point was wrong. His son comes in. We're not given a name. Well, we are earlier, but it's not emphasized here. His character is, you know, the schoolboy. Very small, very universal characteristic, very recognizable. Nothing particularly specific about this kid, but he's just supposed to be this sweet, innocent, probably pre-pubescent child who comes in and he's sad. He is full of empathy for his dying father, and Ivan just cradles his sweet little cherubic face and cries. At that very moment, Ivan Ilyich fell through and saw a light, and it was revealed to him that his life had been wrong, but that it was still possible to mend things. What is right? He asks. He opened his eyes and looked at his son. He felt sorry for him. His wife came to him. He looked at her. She looked at him, mouth open and tears on her nose and cheeks that she hadn't wiped away. See, she cares. He felt sorry for her. Yes, I make them unhappy, he thought. They are sorry for me, but it'll be better for them when I die. He feels sorry, he feels empathy for these people who are suffering because of him. he hasn't expressed that before. He hasn't felt in the least bit responsible for his behavior. Now, from his perspective, a lot of their behavior, particularly the wife's, has been hostile, antagonistic, passive-aggressive, blatantly aggressive at times. But in this little moment, she is genuinely sad. I think it's clear that he is dying. There is a genuine moment, a real exchange. They're both confronting the inevitability and the reality of death in that moment, and they can't look away. And that's when he dies. He gives up right then. As a conscious act, he dies. Now, he sees this as the moment of epiphany at the end of his life that, okay, I was wrong, I admit it, I'm ready to die now. In a Christian term, from what he was going through in this point in his life, Tolstoy is recognizing a basic core tenet that you get from, essentially, most notably, I would say, St. Augustine. Augustine writing in the Confessions and how many other things that he wrote, where it is where life itself is a kind of death, because it is so weighted down. Remember, weightness, light, light, weighted down with the stuff and material realities and animal realities of this world. Human life weighs you down as a kind of death until your heart stops and you are born into your spiritual self. You can shed this ugly, heavy world and discover the truth of a kind of enlightenment, if you will. This is where he's going in this, and this story lays out that basic progression. You can chart that. Critics have done it, where they go through the different steps of Christian rebirth and all of that stuff, and they can say, well, okay, here he's sort of going through this, and there's the denial phase, and it's like a 12-step program until he gets to that point where he can just let go and embrace his spiritual essence unencumbered. It's a remarkable piece. Of course, there are lots of loose ends. There is the whole relationship with the wife that seems a little bit bizarre. There's the relationship with Gerasim that is admittedly weird and too idealistic for this very realistic story. There are all these little threads that don't quite fit in this package. And here I would say it is Tolstoy reaching the end of realism. Realism and art can really only do so much, because at a certain point you have to wrap things up. Realism is predicated on the belief that, okay, you just sit there and you take notes about the world you see around you. But the thing is, that is inherently uninteresting. You have to make it into a story for it to be art. You have to make it into some sort of form for it to be art. And once you do that, you violate the realism, and it becomes just trivia in Tolstoy's sense. Tolstoy gives up creative writing soon after this. He had done it. He had been through it all. He didn't really care anymore, and he didn't want to be lying. He had seen his fiction like all of the decorations that Ivan Ilyich hangs around his homes. They were just diversions. They were just manifestations of a corrupt soul that is dwelling on all the superficial stuff of the universe instead of grappling with the truth. And from here on out in his career, he will write almost exclusively essays and nonfiction writing, largely spiritual, about Christian conversion and about the duties of humanity among themselves and in relation to God. So on the one hand, this is a great story that works on so many levels and brings in so many profound concepts. But on the other, it's one that does its best to work its way out towards the end and then just sort of fritters apart. There's no real resolution here. There's no real sense in the text itself that he is going on to heaven. He just gives up. And we are to deduce that, well, okay, now he's going to God. And we can bring that to it, but it's not really in the story. He just sort of dies at the end. And it's an act of faith, whether you believe that there's anything that he's going to. Does his life have meaning? Did his suffering have meaning? We're given none of that. I'm not sure Tolstoy really had a good idea himself. I don't particularly care what he did know or thought he knew. My particular perspective is, and it's just me, my particular perspective is this story does everything it has to do and then doesn't do anything more. Because if it had tied up all of those loose ends, it would have felt really false. Here, it just nudges up against the limitations of realistic, mimetic writing and leaves it up to the readers to fill in the blanks after it all goes dark.